Salam, Namaste, Adab, and welcome. Today we are going to hear on Kashmir. The title is Silenced and Invisibilized, the People Inside Naya Kashmir. And the speaker is Anuradha Bhasin, the executive editor of Kashmir Times. And presently she is here in Stanford as a fellow, I guess. And she is one of the experts, considered experts on Kashmir affairs. And she was very instrumental in pursuing the cause for freedom of expression and journalism, and the way government did to Kashmiri journalists. She did a writ petition also. And eventually, they had to all kind of threats and all kind of things she faced. And their Kashmir chapter, Srinagar publication, I think got totally stopped from there. And she will tell you a lot about how is the Kashmir situation, especially how the people are feeling, whether they are feeling silenced or they can express. And the introductory and concluding remarks will be given by Dr. Angana Chatterji. Angana Chatterji is a very well-known scholar and expert on Kashmir affairs. I think it's very difficult for me to introduce her because she seems to be everywhere. Every human rights organization, any hearing in the Congress here or international places, United Nations, she is present everywhere. She is one of the very well-known human rights activists here, as well as even in earlier time in Kashmir, in other parts of India. So welcome you all. And now I invite Dr. Angana Chatterji to do the introductory part. Later she will do the concluding part. Hello, Angana.
Hi, thank you, Razi Saab. It's a pleasure to be here, and Anuradha, to be on this panel with you. And thank you for the book and for all of your incredible and brave work. I'd like to offer just a few remarks entitled The Erasure of Kashmir. The Narendra Modi-led Bharatiya Janata Party's use of extreme law and policy to further forms of coloniality in Kashmir seeks to actualize long-standing promises to unify India as a Hindu nationalist state. On August 5, in recent memory, 2019, Kashmir's partial autonomy was countermanded through the nullification of Article 370 and the revocation of Article 35A of the Indian Constitution. State forces swelled in number, operationalizing drastic measures to contain civilian movement and civil disobedience, enforce curfew and cyber surveillance, and heighten control over communication and information, in effect, to govern without consent. People were detained warrantlessly. The state's Human Rights Commission was disbanded with over 639 cases of enforced disappearances pending before it without establishing an equivalent body. By May 2020, the Indian government removed certain legal barriers to permanent residency for non-Kashmiris in Kashmir to potentially reconstitute its demographic makeup and render Muslims a minority. Let me restate that. By May 2020, the Indian government removed certain legal barriers to permanent residency for non-Kashmiris in Kashmir to potentially reconstitute its demographic makeup and render Muslims a minority. Demographic reconstitution endangers Kashmiri claims to internal self-determination and external self-determination from alien exploitation and subjugation. In March 2022, India's Ministry of Home Affairs reportedly green-lighted the constitution of village defense groups in Jammu and Kashmir, comprising armed Hindu descent militias, warning of increasing terror threat levels without evidence. For proponents of Kashmiri self-determination, the above that I mentioned is especially damaging. Demographic reconstruction stands to diminish the integrity of Kashmiris as a people. It imperils their right to place and to language. It endangers their claims to internal self-determination and in turn claims of external self-determination from alien exploitation and subjugation. For decades, protracted political violence has rendered a life of rights impossible in Kashmir, where Muslims are in a majority. Kashmir is witness to enforced disappearances, gendered and sexualized violences, displacement, torture, extrajudicial executions, psyops, and the burial of civilians in unknown, unmarked, and mass graves that my colleagues of Jammu Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society and I, through the International People's Tribunal, had investigated. Impunity laws, including the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, the Jammu Kashmir Disturbed Areas Act, now lapsed, and Jammu Kashmir Public Safety Act, have offered de facto immunity to state forces personnel. Many in Kashmir understand themselves to be under Indian occupation, living in context akin to collective internment. Conditions on the ground are in a state of emergency. It is a place of no rights, shackled in concertina wire, suffocating in a condition of interminable lockdown. Unrelenting militaristic and legal hostility to social dissent targets civilians, journalists, lawyers, laborers, academics, health professionals, students, and their allies. The alignment of national security with aggressive majoritarianism in India prohibits reflection on why Kashmiris resist. Such reflection itself, let alone the dissent of Kashmiris, is represented as seditious. The social and political breakage of Kashmir has its genesis in history. The unchecked spread of majoritarianism in India through the decades during which Hindu nationalists were not in elected office created the political and legal context whereby the dismantling of Kashmir can now occupy center stage in a Hindu nationalist government. The Hindu rights election in 2014 and re-election in India in 2019 has profoundly impacted Kashmir. Casteist, racist, Islamophobic, and heteronormative, the government led by Mr. Modi has sought to weaponize religion and politics to incite the Hindu majority. Kashmiri Muslims have been repeatedly depicted as enemies of India and as potential agents of terror, and allies of India as anti-national and seditious. To close my opening remarks, I wish to say that contemporary relations position the Indian state as righteous protectors of the national domain and Kashmiris as impostors on their land. The 2019 and 20 decrees were implemented, and the law was used to suspend a binding contract between peoples, making absolute or seeking to make absolute India's rule of power in Kashmir. The BJP's furtherance of forms of coloniality in Kashmir seeks to actualize long-standing promises, as I noted at start, to unify Akhand Bharat. In this new Kashmir, the ground has cracked open, a Kashmiri woman stated to me after the events of August. All the fear and misery and terror of yesterday is channeled into a new and unknown tragedy that is exploding. It feels like massive prison grates have clamped shut around our Kashmir, our neighborhood, and my heart. We can't breathe. Thank you.
Good. And now we are ready to hear you, Anuradha.
Thank you, Raziji. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Angana, for setting the context. And as Angana mentioned in a very brief presentation or introduction, that Kashmir is an ongoing project of the Indian government, and particularly a Hindu majoritarian sentiment. And there is a continuity of what has happened post-2019 from what has been happening in the last 7 decades. However, the Hindu majoritarian parties or Modi-led government has weaponized excessively the majoritarian sentiment and Hindu right-wing ideology against against Kashmiris. Jammu and Kashmir, actually, when I use the word Kashmir, I have used it interchangeably because it means different things. It stands for the Kashmir Valley, and it also stands for the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And people of Kashmir, and Kashmir has been in more crisis than rest of the state, but rest of Jammu and Kashmir has also suffered. So I will try and simplify that, but in certain places I have used it interchangeably. But Kashmir Valley has been my main focus. It's Muslim majority, and the overall majority in Jammu and Kashmir is overwhelmingly Muslim as well, which is why it is of special interest for the Hindu right wing to subjugate and to lord over. Now, on August 5th, 2019, in one fell swoop, the political and geographical map of Jammu and Kashmir was dismantled, altering the lives of 14 million people living there. The J&K Reorganization Act, tabled and passed in the parliament without much debate, dismembered the state into Ladakh and J&K, both units demoted to union territories. Article 370, which had been the umbilical cord that tied Jammu and Kashmir to in the Indian Union, was done away with. And before this was done, extra troops had been mobilized in Jammu and Kashmir, which already enjoyed the distinction of being the most militarized region in the world. Section 144 was imposed across the state, and curfew-like restrictions were in place. Internet and phone communication, landline phones included, were banned in the entire Kashmir Valley and Muslim majority districts of Jammu region. In rest of the state, the communication services were partially impacted. And while this was happening, the Indian Prime Minister congratulated the nation and sketched the vision of Naya Kashmir that would usher in an era of peace, development, and democracy. Ever since, we have heard lesser and lesser about the people of Kashmir, about its society, about its politics and economy. And other than the official claims parroted to the hilt by embedded journalists of big investments being made, development taking place, and robust tourism, we know very little about Kashmir. No elections have been held. Independent journalism has been criminalized or targeted. Civil society has been silenced. And those who once spoke for the public no longer have a voice to speak. What has happened to Jammu and Kashmir in the last 4 years since the reading down of Article 370? In any liberal democracy, people are at the center of democracy, in which people elect representatives to govern them and also have the power to hold them to account. But in this vision of a democratic new Kashmir, the people are being deliberately invisibilized and unheard. What really is democratic about the new Kashmir that the government is professing to build? And before I begin to unpack these questions, it would be in order to talk a little about the history of Article 370. Article 370 affirmed the special status of J&K and its peculiar history because it had acceded to India under exceptional circumstances. When the subcontinent was partitioned on religious lines in August of 1947, Jammu and Kashmir was an overwhelmingly Muslim majority region ruled by a Hindu monarch. And like the other princely states, he was given the choice of opting for either of the two dominions. He chose to accede to neither till October 26, 1947. And then the Maharaja of Kashmir was forced to enter into a hurried accession with India when the tribals from the northwest frontier province, allegedly patronized by Pakistani army, raided Kashmir in exchange for Indian Army's help to repel the attack. Unlike the other princely states that acceded to India, the case of Jammu and Kashmir was different. It was a large state and geographically contiguous to both India and Pakistan. The circumstances of accession were different. The conditions were different. It was specified by the monarch in the instrument of accession that nothing in this instrument shall be deemed to commit me to accept any future constitution of India or fetter my discretion to enter into arrangements with the government of India under any such future constitution. A letter by the monarch was written to Lord Mountbatten, stating the exceptional conditions vis-a-vis the tribal invasion as well as the geographical and cultural contiguity with both dominions. Lord Mountbatten replied that as soon as law and order was restored in Kashmir and its soil cleared of invaders, the question of the state's accession should be settled by a reference to the people. The UN resolutions on Kashmir also uphold this right of the people, and this was later promised by India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. But none of these obligations have been fulfilled. India's legitimacy to Kashmir thus hinged on Article 370. When the Indian Constitution was being framed, Article 370 was added, giving India jurisdiction over J&K on 3 subjects: defense, foreign affairs, and communication. Article 370 was immensely significant for several reasons. It acted as a constitutional bridge between J&K and rest of India. It was a constitutional recognition of the conditions under which Kashmir had acceded to India. It reflected the contractual rights and obligations of the two parties. But Article 370 was already hollowed out through several presidential orders and legislations much before 2019. 260 out of 395 articles of the Indian Constitution had already been extended to the state to the detriment of autonomy of the state and to the detriment of the asymmetric federalism of India. However, what was left of this special provision was not insignificant. Despite the many dilutions, Article 370 conferred on its permanent residents special and exclusive rights like employment in state government services, business investments, acquisition of immovable property, etc. So for the people of J&K, it meant protection of those rights. When Article 370 was revoked, Article 35A was also revoked. Article 35A was only a clarificatory provision that defined who a permanent resident of J&K is. Now, these laws were diluted by putting J&K reorganization bill to vote in Parliament, and this was passed by a majority. Constitutionally, this could not have been done. Only the J&K Constituent Assembly had the right to take any decision on Article 370. After the framing of J&K Constitution, it was disbanded in 1956. And using modification powers under Indian and the J&K Constitution, this power could have been transferred only to an elected assembly of J&K. But that had been dissolved in 2018, when J&K was put under direct presidential rule. So what the Indian government did to revoke 370 is to transfer the power of the Constituent Assembly to the president and from the president to the parliament. The people had no voice in the matter. It was done in the parliament where J&K had minimal representation. So people basically were not given a choice to decide their future. Instead, while taking these decisions and celebrating them as harbingers of democracy, peace, and development, The ground reality within J&K defied all these principles. The government had imposed curfew-like restrictions across Jammu and Kashmir, and internet was banned in most places fully, and in some places partially. Phone lines were banned. The people of J&K were pushed behind an iron wall. The communication ban disrupted daily lives. People had no access to healthcare, and particularly in Kashmir Valley, because of curfew and lack of phones. Those who were suffering serious ailments had to trek to the nearest hospitals, which in remote areas are often distantly located. The poor could not avail of health welfare schemes because these were digitized. The doctors had no internet or phone access. The schools were shut for several months. Businesses were shut. Journalists were unable to perform. There was little or no information about the areas that were facing a stringent communication ban. Bits and scraps of information poured out of Srinagar, the main capital city, where the major news was that the entire political leadership of Kashmir, which included separatists and pro-India leaders, also 3 former chief ministers, had been jailed. But about the other areas, there was no information at all. And under a veneer of silence and under military jackboots, massive arrests took place. People from cross sections of society, including academics, journalists, lawyers, businessmen, civil society activists, and nobodies, many minors included, were being detained, released, rearrested. Some were arrested for prolonged periods, and there were cases of repeated harassment, also cases of torture. How much of that is still going on? 4 years on, we have no means of finding out because the reporters, the journalists, and the sources at the ground, people at the ground, have been silenced. People are scared to talk. They fear they may be arrested, lose their jobs, invite a raid by anti-terror forces to their homes if they speak. While this new mechanism of systemically terrorizing people in Kashmir began, the Home Minister, Mr. Amit Shah, boasted that not a drop of blood was shed. While this was not entirely true, because some incidents that came to light did nail this lie, there was indeed lesser bloodshed than Kashmir has previously witnessed. However, an overwhelming sense of fear, immense humiliation, and impotence was perpetuated through a sustained, systemic, and a highly sophisticated policy that was unprecedented. Under excessive militarization and unparalleled repression, a deep sense of fear has engendered silence in Jammu and Kashmir. It has not stopped or lessened. It has deepened even more in the last 4 years. So how does one expect a democratic outcome from a change whose foundation is based on disregard of constitution, lack of democratic norms, and violation of human rights? The visible signs of democracy are free and fair elections, system of accountability, a healthy and participatory civil society, an independent press, and equitable and inclusive development in accordance with the needs and aspirations of the people. Is that really happening? So if you look at the basic ingredient of democracy, elections, I'm going to take it one by one: elections, the civil society, the press, and about development. Politics in Kashmir has always been manipulated in the last 7 decades, and rulers have been overthrown and even jailed even before. New Delhi has violated democratic principles in imposing their favorites, in other words, getting more pliable politicians in the last 7 decades. The BJP government under Modi has completely marginalized and silenced all politicians. And majority of the non-BJP political leaders and activists were jailed for almost a year or put under house arrest. Even after their release, they are constantly being pressurized and intimidated by naming them in terror cases, money laundering cases, etc., to mute the political voices completely. Constitutional propriety was disregarded by going ahead with the delimitation of Jammu and Kashmir's electoral constituencies, even though there was a nationwide freeze on the process till 2026. The delimitation process is replete with massive errors because the foundational principle of population size has been set aside and invalid criteria introduced. Geographically and culturally incompatible areas have been brought together, and congruous areas have been bifurcated in one of the most glaring examples of gerrymandering of electoral boundaries. And this is done in a bid to ensure there is division of Muslim vote and consolidation of a Hindu vote bank. New parties with unknown faces in the lead are being propped up and are being introduced not through Jammu and Kashmir, but through television news channels via Delhi. Yet, despite marginalizing the old guards and engineering new political faces, the BJP is not confident of achieving its desired goal of having a Hindu chief minister, a BJP chief minister, to rule India's only Muslim majority region. Thus, no elections have been held in J&K. The last elections were held in 2014. So that's so much for the electoral needs of democracy. Now about civil society. After 2019, the civil society has been completely invisibilized. NGOs, non-government organizations, and activists began to be intimidated and threatened with income tax and money laundering cases. Some activists have faced anti-terror raids. And in November 2021, one of the leading and world-renowned human rights activists, Khurram Parvez, was arrested under the draconian anti-terror law and continues to be in Tihar jail ever since. His arrest immensely impacted the other activists working on the ground, halting their work completely and pushing them out of the public space, either because they were working with him or there was a sense of fear after his arrest. It needs to be pointed out that even in the most turbulent phases of Kashmir's conflict, civil society survived and people's resistance was visible, though the forms have been diverse and changing. And what most people know about Kashmir in recent times were the street protests. But there was resistance that was also very non-violent and creative. There were sit-ins by civil society. There was creative articulation of dissent through art, poetry, writings, graffiti, and resistance has also been visible through everyday lived-in reality. One of the longest sustained struggles for justice has been that of the Association of Parents of Disappeared. It comprises families of men who were picked up by different security agencies and disappeared in custody. And decades after their enforced disappearance, the families seek justice and truth about their missing kin. On the 10th of every month, and this is before 2019, these families, mostly comprising women and led by Parveena Hanger, would assemble at Srinagar's city center to stage their sit-in. Media and other civil society members would come to their site of protest to express solidarity. Since 2019, such campaigns have disappeared completely. NIA also conducted raids on Parveena Ahanger and APDP offices, apart from J&K Coalition of Civil Society. Artistic resistance has also gone underground, and indoor public discussions have been banned. In fact, any discussion on Kashmir by civil society members now is banned not only in Kashmir, but in any other parts of the country, and there are quite a few documented examples. So apart from civil society, a damaging blow has been made to journalism. Journalism has been completely silenced. And journalism is the backbone of democracy. Journalists are the daily chroniclers of events and happenings. They bring to the public domain the shortcomings of the government and the voices of the unheard and marginalized. Today, no free and independent press exists in Kashmir. It has been silenced under military jackboots. First, it was the internet shutdown, which compelled journalists to work out of a small shared space with 3 to 4 computers set up by the government for over 150 to 200 journalists, who not only jostled with each other to get a few minutes behind the computer, they also complained of erratic and poor internet connectivity. Besides, their entire work was under government surveillance, and this happened till another 6 months. As journalists gradually began to resume normal work, when internet was restored and also they tried to do more investigative work, they were face to face with new challenges: summons, raids, arrests, criminal charges. And this has now become the norm and made it extremely impossible for journalists to operate. Though some journalists were released after they were imprisoned, 4 continue to remain in jails, some slapped with draconian provisions of anti-terror laws. Solidarity organizations like Kashmir Press Club have been shut down, and many journalists have been put on the no-fly list. That is, they are barred from traveling abroad. And all this has instilled a deep sense of fear among journalists, many of whom have either quit or resorted to self-censorship. The local newspapers no longer publish anything that is critical of the government. In fact, they are compelled to carry on their front pages only the content that publicizes the government's achievements, and they are richly rewarded with big government advertisements. So when journalists, civil society, politicians become silent, the voices of the rest are automatically muted. The silence is deafening. It is occasionally punctured by a visiting journalist. And this abnormality, if some of you have seen, was recently, it was reflected in the few reports by Arfa Khanam, who reported from Ground Zero in a series of televised reports for The Wire. Or there were articles very recently by a young journalist, Anand Singh, for Deccan Herald. It's called Wordless Valley, or Sangamitra Chakrabarti's A Tourist Kashmir Diary for The Scroll. But these are very few reports and occasional reports. In such a scenario, the only kind of narrative that thrives in Jammu and Kashmir or about Jammu and Kashmir is one that is peddled by the government or endorsed by the government. There is a lot of talk about tourism and development. There are statistics doled out that do not add up, or they skirt serious issues at stake. For instance, in March 2022, the UT administration, the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir, claimed that 33,000 crore rupees investments were made in the fiscal year 2021-2022. It was also claimed that this was double than all the investments made in J&K since 1947. The Lieutenant Governor announced that in 2022-2023, investments will cross 75,000 crore rupees. In October 2022, reports in local press stated that investment projects worth rupees 10,000 crore had been made in J&K. However, the Ministry of Home Affairs data released in the Parliament in December 2022, right after these claims were being made, stated that the total investment in 2021-2022 was only rupees 376 crores, down from rupees 412 crores in 2020-21 and a massive drop of 55% from 840 crores in 2017 and 2018. So a month later, the same Home Ministry released more data, stating that J&K received investments worth 56,000 crores in the past 3 years. Now, these figures were contrary to the ministry's reply in the Lok Sabha in December 2022, where the total investment was said to be 1,000 plus crores in the last, since 2019. And a recent report in June this year, again, by LiveMint, quoted data from the new industrial policy officials. According to this, a total of over 5,000 investment proposals have been received for J&K, amounting to about 66,000 crores. And these are simply proposals, but are projected as actual investments of projects that are under execution. And even if we were to assume that there is some truth about tens of thousands of crores of investments being made, where is the investment being made? How much of this is part of the projects that were already under execution? What kind of new industries are being opened? Who is making these investments? And what does it mean for the local population? The celebratory statistics that are often peddled out both by the government and the embedded journalists are not backed by evidence of the much hyped schemes. And what are these schemes? Can they have an adverse impact on the local people and the ecology? None of this is out in the public domain, even as there are valid concerns among the locals. There have been some simmerings of discontent, even as Kashmir Valley is more muted. But these simmerings of discontent have come from Ladakh and Jammu over the new development vision. Laws and policies have been massively restructured after abrogation of Article 370, turning the state upside down as its subjugated people watch in submissive silence. Out of 334 state laws, 164 laws were repealed and 167 laws were adapted. And notably in October 2020, 26 acts related to land laws were repealed or amended. And these have by and large changed the nature of land laws. And this is going to impact Jammu and Kashmir immensely, because J&K had its own land related laws where the state was the biggest owner of the land, but also was the protector of people's rights. Lands were often given on leases to people for residential, agricultural, or business purposes. Land reforms in the 1950s had given land to the tiller, and subsequent laws had offered extra protection to the agrarian communities. Now, these are all gone. New laws thus make it easier for the government to acquire huge land holdings in the name of security or development. And though the Fair Compensation Act for land acquisitions has been extended, this has not been adhered to. Lands which were earlier earmarked for certain purposes but had not been fully regularized because of complacency or corruption that has always been a part and parcel of Jammu and Kashmir were declared as state lands, and people are being evicted. Their homes demolished, and without any adequate notice, without giving them a chance to be heard, they are being declared as encroachers and land grabbers. And all this is happening without any investigation. This is not to say that everything that is happening is to the detriment of the people. Some people would definitely have something to gain. For instance, those connected with tourism. That accounts for just 10 to 15% of the population of Kashmir. In Kashmir Valley, the projected figures of tourism for 2023-24 are 20 million. But is that good? How ecologically sustainable can that be in a region that only has 7 to 8 million people? What are the other impacts of tourism, positive or adverse, on people's lives? Where are these missing stories? The claims about development are flawed or overhyped. And there are instead worries of vulnerability among the local population because they fear that they might lose their jobs, they might lose their exclusive rights to admissions to higher seats of education, where 50% reservation in the old system was made for women in professional colleges. They might lose businesses or business contracts to big businessmen from outside. And because the big crony capitalists from mainland India can pay a pittance for lands and contracts while the locals are being completely marginalized. And besides, this new model of development also has an ecological impact. And to remind everyone, this is a fragile Himalayan belt. So if you look at the major identifiers of democracy, elections, a strong civil society, independent media, equitable and inclusive development, none of this is part of Naya Kashmir. Before this Naya Kashmir was envisioned by Narendra Modi government, Jammu and Kashmir was already a state torn by decades of strife, a historic conflict, insurgency, and excessive militarization. Extrajudicial laws like Armed Forces Special Powers Act have turned most parts of J&K, particularly the Kashmir Valley, into a large cantonment and have enabled paramilitary forces to indulge in egregious violation of human rights. The overwhelming sense of alienation and existence of the overwhelming sense of alienation and existence of separatist sentiment in the valley before 2019 has been well documented. Has that changed? No. While a perception is being created that people of J&K are being integrated, they are being alienated more and more since 5th August 2019. With Article 370 of the Constitution struck off, they have been demoted and disenfranchised, not just politically, but also as citizens, with civil liberties in tatters, not just through military repression, but also through the violence of subtle actions and words. And one of the most horrifying fallout of this project is the possibility of engineering an Israeli-style demographic change with far-reaching and long-term repercussions. And even though this may take a long time to come, there are widespread fears in the valley of a demographic change becoming an eventuality. Equally worrying is the new strategy adopted since the loss of J&K's special status to maintain a sophisticated system of surveillance in Kashmir that is seen as impinging on civil liberties of the people. It's not just surveillance. Surveillance is followed by criminalizing of many people losing jobs, etc. And political scientists like Shumantra Bose have likened this to the Chinese way of handling Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Now, this kind of a policy of invisibilizing and silencing people and rupturing democracy, whose interest does it serve? Some apologists justify that what is happening in Kashmir is in the national interest. It is being done because it serves the national interest. Is it? How can dehumanizing, humiliating, and disempowering 14 million people serve the interest of a nation? It is difficult to view Jammu and Kashmir in isolation from the rest of India and its dominant political narrative. India's Kashmir narrative, as curated by the Indian government and its loyalist media, pumps up the majoritarian Hindu contempt for Muslims, Kashmiris, Pakistan, and terrorists, identities that blend and blur into one another in their minds. And conversely, the ruptured secularism and politics of hate, which is happening pan-India, is stretching into Jammu and Kashmir and exacerbating the divisive politics within. This has begun to evince itself in a far more brazen form since 2014, after the rise of the RSS-backed Modi government. From 2014, India began to witness a gradual, unannounced, but continuous and systemic process of dismantling the mechanisms put in place by the Indian Constitution that held its executive accountable to the people. The three strands of accountability that operate vertically through adult franchise and parliament, horizontally through institutions and ombudsmen like the judiciary, and diagonally through media, academia, and civil society, have come under severe stress. And the institutional decay that began in 2014 resulted in the gradual disappearance of all levels and hierarchies of accountability. Post-2019, the BJP under Narendra Modi is making even more far-reaching changes to India's constitutional order to increase its own authority at the cost of democratic order, secularism, and accountability to parliament. The new India, projected as strong and united, is being envisioned not by inclusion, but exclusion of its people through laws like Citizenship Amendment Act, and National Register of Citizens, and actions like lynchings of Dalits and Muslims, attacking mosques and churches, demolishing houses, particularly of minorities, unlawfully and unchecked hate speeches, through weaponizing traditional cleavages and complexities to create a violent crisis as it is unfolding in Manipur since the last more than 2 decades. If we look at today's India and view how the state chooses to quell people's struggles and rebellions against the many injustices through tyrannical methods of thrashing, intimidating and arresting activists, intellectuals, media persons, and minorities, there is a feeble but uncanny resemblance with Kashmir. So ironically, while Modi's government is trying to integrate Kashmir, as they say, what it is effectively doing is making India an extension of Kashmir. In terms of dilution of India's federal polity and civil liberties, media regulation policy, and tyrannical methods of dealing with protesters and rebellions with a slew of illegal detentions and vilification campaigns, Indian mainland is experimenting with the Kashmir model elsewhere. And as for Kashmir, India has distanced and lost Kashmiris, perhaps forever. The scrapping of Article 370 has sealed the paths to peace because that formed the basis of any engagement with Kashmiris for an amicable resolution of the Kashmir conflict. In the last 70 years, J&K's autonomy and democracy have witnessed only erosions, not reversals, through a consistent string of betrayals. The final betrayal with far-reaching consequences on its socio-economic and political landscape has annihilated even the tiniest speck of pretense of democracy. As a consequence, in Kashmir Valley, there is neither the hope of a resolution nor the desire to remain linked to India. By taking away J&K's special status, India stands to be the bigger loser, as it has completely stonewalled a longer lasting peaceful resolution. The Indian government can use all its power to subjugate and suppress the local people in J&K and also their multiple and complex aspirations for now. But it cannot sustain this till eternity. At present, there is immense psychological trauma that may take a long time to heal, if at all. And I have focused more on the Kashmir Valley where the trauma is deeper, but anger, sense of hurt, and disappointment, if not discontent, exists even in Jammu and Ladakh. Militancy is extending into Jammu. Targeted killings of Kashmiri Pandits, other Hindus, and laborers from outside J&K, which had not happened by and large since the decade of 1990s, have increased post-2019. And yet, despite all these vulnerabilities of the people, there is absolute silence, particularly in Kashmir. It's eerie, ghost-like and frighteningly abnormal. While some whimpers of protest have occasionally taken place in Ladakh and Jammu, Kashmir throbs with a silence that is evasive. It exists only under the terror of excessive militarization and concertina wires. What will happen when the military suppression cannot be sustained beyond a point, or when the people, habitual of living in fear, lose their sense of fear? Would Naya Kashmir dangerously become India's undoing? Thank you.
So depressing. It
I'm
is.
sorry to end on a depressing note, but then.
It is so frustrating also, depressing also. There is nothing really what we can say about it. We all know, but you elaborated it. It is really too much to bear. But anyway, let's hear Dr. Angana Chatterji again for the concluding remarks, and then people will be participating in the question and answer session. Dr. Chatterji, please.
Yes, thank you so much. I want to speak to three issues in about 7 to 8 minutes. First is entitled Counter Memory. As a non-Kashmiri, my work has been shaped through solidarity. I traveled to Kashmir for the first time in the summer of 2006. While there, advocate Pervez Imroz and human rights defender Khurram Pervez invited me to collaborate in imagining a formative civil society process for answerability to human rights crimes and atrocities. Together, we co-founded the International People's Tribunal on Human Rights and Justice in Indian-administered Kashmir. The tribunal determined to uncover, highlight, and seek accountability to the history and regimentation of atrocities that structure Kashmir's political conflict and is perpetrated as a strategy in governance. I met with torture survivors and civilians who testified to the sadism of state forces. We documented instances of waterboarding, mutilation, rape of women, children, and men, and starvation and psychological torture. I met with former militants who spoke to the above and of their own use of violence and the imperative of atonement. I learned that every individual I met in Kashmir had intimate knowledge of the state's violence and had a story to tell. A man reportedly hung upside down had petrol injected through his anus, brutalized, to be tortured again. A mother reportedly asked to watch her daughter's rape by army personnel, pleaded for her daughter's release. They refused. She pleaded that she could not watch and asked to be sent out of the room or killed. We were told that the soldier pointed a gun to her forehead and shot her before they proceeded to rape the daughter. Then we investigated the unknown, unmarked, and mass graves in Kashmir. I myself documented, along with my colleagues, 2,700 graves holding 2,943 bodies. This is before 2019. The capacity and ability and indifference of those in India, in government and otherwise, to stand by and let decades of such violence be perpetrated has actually led to the possibility even of the Hindu nationalist state to be instated in power today. Kashmir attests today to an extraordinary scale of mass atrocities and human rights crimes against particularly its majority Muslim inhabitants. A complex system of impunity laws is used to enforce militarized governance, extending immunity to one of the largest military forces in the world, furthering India's occupying power. Violence, as a category of analysis, reveals often the distance and continuity between daily and spectacular acts of violence. Violence in Kashmir has endangered a landscape where the death of men, and it is largely men that have died, have rendered vulnerable women, children, and other gender-identified groups. Violence against civilian men has expanded spaces for enacting violence against women. Women have been forced to disproportionately assume the task of caregiving to disintegrated families and undertake the work of seeking justice following disappearances and deaths at extraordinary harm and risk to themselves. Lines in the sand. The BJP furthers forms of coloniality in Kashmir while seizing citizenship away from Bangla Muslims and other vulnerable communities in Assam. The reconstitution of domicile laws of May 2020 in Assam will induce dangerous effects. They subdue the appearance of political conflict in Kashmir by rearranging facts on the ground, suppressing and dissipating movements for freedom, justice, and accountability. An extraordinary militarization, xenophobic, authoritarian, suffuses public and domestic life. Psychosocial violence in Kashmir is anticipated, experienced, and proximate to everyday life today. Engaging the effects of India's rule in Kashmir demands itself an acknowledgement of India's neo-imperial configuration as a nation today, and a recognition that nations are regularly, routinely, compulsorily violent. Arbitrary detention. The Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, expanded by the Modi government, enables special procedures to identify a person as a terrorist while denying them due judicial process and trial. It extends exceptional power and jurisdiction to detain and arrest people and levy charges. This act, the UAPA, is conspicuously absent, however, in cases of hate speech, terror, and violence concerning Hindu nationalist perpetrators. Certain UAPA incarcerations also constitute arbitrary detention, where individuals are held without legal basis for the dispossession of their freedoms. The law is perhaps harshest on Muslim Kashmiris and persons of minority descent and those caste oppressed in India. In Kashmir, the UAPA singles out Muslim descent individuals, including renowned human rights defender Khurram Parvez, journalist Irfan Mehraj, and political leader Yasin Malik. The UAPA has been used to disallow bail, silence civil society dissent, punish expressions of grief, rage, and mourning, and harm human rights work and media reportage. Increasingly, the law is used to register cases against individuals in lieu of the Public Safety Act, and cases booked under the PSA are changed to the UAPA. This law has been used to register cases against juveniles and against civil society members for sloganeering at a funeral. In Kashmir, grieving itself is seditious. In 2014, reportedly 45 cases were booked under the UAPA, while in 2019, reportedly 255 such cases were registered. Khurram Parvez, my colleague, was arrested by the National Investigation Agency on November 22nd, 2021. The state reportedly alleged that Parvez was conducting investigations as a ploy to fundraise for terror activities and collect information on state forces personnel who are perpetrators of human rights crimes, to assemble a dossier with the location and movement of troops and the structure of army camps. The NIA claimed reportedly that Parvez bribed persons for information, met with persons dangerous to the state, communicated with members of Kashmir's Hurriyat and journalists in Pakistan, and sloganeered against India in protest following Burhan Wani's death in July 2006, omitting here that Wani's death led to massive civil society protests across Kashmir. The charges against Khurram Parvez misrepresent a human rights defender's work on the impact of atrocities committed by state forces, which of necessity requires travel, inquiry, and the publication of movements, actions, and details of state forces. Khurram Parvez remains in the custody of the state, his bail hearing pending. The UAPA case against Parvez exemplifies both the state's malice toward Muslim Kashmir and the severity of disorder imploding India's democracy. His incarceration also may constitute arbitrary detention. In closing, I wish to say that it is imperative to underscore that the Hindu nationalist state has weaponized political and social fault lines and structural Islamophobia in Kashmir. The relations between a Hindu-dominant Indian state and its governance of Muslim-prevalent Kashmir are shaped by India's production of Islam, Muslims, and violence as coextensive with one another, and democracy as being dissociated from Islam. The Indian state's use of extreme laws normalizes absolute nationalism and advances new forms of social erasure. Arbitrary governance is amplified in the name of India's well-being, saturating the lives of millions of Muslims in Kashmir and in India and their allies and secular Hindus as well, with everyday and exceptional violence. As Hindu nationalists call for genocidal violence against Muslims repeatedly, India's leadership of the group of G20 attests to how the Modi-led government's actions continue unchecked by international attention or consequences. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for elaborating and expressing. And it is really very quite disturbing, but we do not know what else we can do except to bring you guys and express here. And in solidarity, if there are any other things we can do, we'll appreciate. Well, just an announcement for coming Saturday. As usual, Danish Abbas' turn, but we are missing the title and the participants. But anyway, he will be doing it on Saturday. Over to our moderator, Dr. Rafat Hussain, who will be entertaining the questions for the question and answer session. Thank you both. Rafat.
Yeah, thank you, Razi Bhai, and thank you to Anuradha Bhasin and Dr. Chatterji for giving us the updates on Kashmir. And the session is open for question and answer. And most of you know how to ask the questions. So please raise your digital hand, or you can show your interest in the chat box. So let's see. So first person is Dr. Fazal Khan. Go ahead. I see the digital hand raised.
First, let me thank both speakers for an excellent talk, though depressing. Nonetheless, it's very informative. And in all honesty, it's not easy to ask question on this. But a couple of things that I wanted to say. As far as UAPA is concerned, it was there even before 2014. And BJP might have implemented this little harshly than UPA government. The second thing is that BJP-led government or Modi-led government has done only what they had publicly stated in their election manifesto. So India is a democratic country. They are elected by overwhelming majority. And when I say overwhelming majority means in parliament, their vote share may not be more than 50% or whatever. Nonetheless, they are fulfilling their promise, what they did before the election. It's see, Kashmir seems to be like Palestine. As long as general public is not affected by disturbance or whatever happening in Kashmir, it doesn't matter to general public. So they are elected and they might get elected again. So they are only fulfilling the wishes of the public, which elects them democratically. So how do you reconcile with that?
You want to go, Angana, or?
Up to you. You decide.
Okay.
Either of you.
You want me to say something, Anuradha,
Yeah,
first?
go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I think two things. One is that the UAPA, as you rightly said, had existed before. It's a law passed. It has colonial legacy. The Prevention Act was passed in the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act was passed in 1967, and it's been amended in 69, 72, 86, 2004, 2008, 2012, and expanded by the Modi government in 2019. And yes, while it has been implemented by governments preceding this, the Modi-led government, the Modi-led government has enforced certain aspects of it with, with sort of aggressiveness. And often it has also used the amendments made before it came to power. And that's something to note, which brings me to your other point that this is a government that was elected by the people. It then leads us to question the notion and role of assent in Indian politics. Our understanding of freedom and our understanding of what a democracy can be, and how authoritarianism and democracy have become compatible in this historical present. Secondly, the capacity of the Modi-led state to function as it does, the role of Hindu majoritarianism today in India is preceded by the structuring of the Indian state, where caste oppression proliferated, where Islamophobia was central to how it was organized, where notions, absurd though it was, of soft Hindutva proliferated if it was not hardcore Hindutva, where organizations that were constituted as militias on the ground, namely the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh and other Hindu nationalist organizations, for decades have functioned with impunity and no consequences. Their imprint has been found in every organized violence since 1947 that has taken place against minorities. When epical violences like Gujarat 2002, for example, have taken place, the response of the state, and not the BJP-led state at that point, the response of the state has often been to institute commissions which have taken years or even decades to render their verdict and have had no legal authority, those verdicts. So there is a way in which Hindu nationalism, majoritarianism and cultural dominance and the violence of history and partition that we have inherited and refused to deal with, and as well Adivasi erasure. I don't want to forget that, because about over 47 million Adivasis have been displaced from their lands since 1947 in India. All of those erasures and violences is what Indian democracy has been manufactured on. And unless we also deal with that, going ahead into the future, simply, for example, through another electoral process, getting rid of the BJP will not take us to what we need to institute in order to have India remain viable to itself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anuradha
Do
ji,
you want to add something to that?
do you want to add?
No, not really. I think Angana has successfully put it excellently, that, two things about how do we move forward. And we do need to look back at what the mistakes that we made and, unpack all that started with the horrors of partition and thereon. One thing I'd like to add, when you say the majority, yes, the Modi government has come twice. It has won with overwhelming majority, and that is a majoritarian sentiment. And for the Hindu right-wing ideological project of turning India into a Hindu Rashtra, Kashmir is very central to their project. because Kashmir is Muslim majority, and which is why they want to suppress, subjugate, dominate, and dehumanize, maybe even render Kashmiris as non-citizens. That is very central and crucial to their project. And though that has been the policy of previous governments as well, to subjugate Kashmiris, because there was an overwhelming lack of trust of Kashmiris, but they were guided by lack of trust. And this government, the difference is, so there's a continuity and there is a difference right now.
Rafat, because there are not too many questions,
Go
may
ahead.
I
Yeah,
take
please go.
30 more seconds?
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to make one more point, by the way, that it's not only BJP. Even there are many other political parties, so-called secular. Now they have formed a party called India. Even they had supported this, or at least they had not spoken about it. So BJP, it is not exclusive for BJP only. And the reason many other political parties either did not speak or support it, because it's a majority Hindu country. And they don't want to lose their vote share. And that's why, so it's not only BJP, it is others as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And the next person is by the name Himale. Please go ahead and unmute yourself. Go ahead, unmute yourself, please. Yeah, I see you.
Oh, try now, you should be able to unmute.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
thank you. Now I can unmute. So
Rafat,
thank you for
Dr. Chatterji wanted to respond on that.
Okay, we will
giving-
come back. Or should we hold for Himale? Himale Saab, hold on for a second and then we come back to you. Go ahead,
Oh, okay.
Dr. Chatterji.
I think the notion of majoritarian implies that the majority community wishes to and controls the resources, legal, political, social, economic, cultural, that renders it dominant. That's it, right? So I just wanted to clarify. And I think that has been sort of the formative element of Indian democracy. And I think that's something that is important to underscore. And yes, this new India coalition that's been formed, I think going ahead, its manifesto, if it were to publish that, should actually detail how some of the actions undertaken before previously by these same parties will be perhaps revisited and re-examined going ahead. That's going to be incredibly important. And in Kashmir, elsewhere in India as well, it's not so much that the differences between a Congress and a BJP, it's sort of stages of Indian history, stages of Kashmiri history that have led to the present moment. I think that's a clarification that you were making. That's very important. Thank you.
Okay. Himale, please.
Thank you for giving these in-depth perspectives and also backed by data. Two questions to Anuradha ji. As you pointed out, could you tell us about the health issues, particularly the mental health issues that have affected the people of J&K? Is there data to support that women have suffered with these issues of mental and emotional health more? Second thing that you pointed out about ecological concerns that were raised in Ladakh by Sonam Wangchuk, and it got some mileage also. Are there any dialogues between people and activists of Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh on this matter? Do you see a united voice, at least in this matter, as it concerns all three regions and their people directly? And one thing to Angana ji, which she has almost answered, But do you foresee any constitutional or political status and general change in general conditions in J&K if the NDA government loses the next general elections? Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
first
you.
about
Go ahead, Anuradha ji.
yeah. So first about health, I mean, there is a huge psychological trauma. And it's so immense that I mentioned and there's no data as of now. But even before 2019, some of this is documented. I don't randomly remember, but it is. There's been a lot of documentation about psychological health of Kashmiris, and women were equally, if not more, impacted. But as our society is, how we are structured, women stand to have lesser access to health care. And that was a huge issue that, a lot of health practitioners, psychologists, and psychiatrists were talking about. Their condition in the mental health hospitals and their lack of access, the lack of infrastructure in the healthcare facilities. All of that was something that was earlier talked about. Now, post 2019, we don't know. We don't know. We don't have data because we don't have activists working. We don't have journalists working. The doctors are unwilling to talk. People are unwilling to talk. And that is a huge, problem. But, you can get indications of what kind of psychological trauma that people are going through. And I referred to that Arfa Khanum's videos. It didn't say much, but it captured the silence and the depression that people are going through just through focusing on the camera. And there were 2-3 series in which, she's talking to people and she goes into not the touristy areas like most embedded journalists do, but going into downtown and congested areas and talking to people in diverse areas. And she tried talking to people, and the people she spoke to didn't say anything. And they said, we cannot talk. Or they said, at the most, they said, we are scared. Or somebody just started crying. There were 2-3 people who just started crying. So you can sense that overwhelming sense of fear, trauma, and depression that they are going through. Yeah. And second, sorry, I'm forgetting your question.
The ecological issue that you raised. Is there any dialogue between...
Okay, yeah, right. Is there any dialogue? I don't know of. If there is a dialogue happening, any kind of meeting that you're going to organize in Kashmir today or including Kashmiris, it's disallowed. If something is happening digitally in the digital space, quietly, I am not sure. But another thing to add is, though there are common concerns in Ladakh and in Jammu and Kashmir, it's also true that for years there are existing complexities within. Jammu is Hindu majority. There are certain districts in Jammu which are very, very Hindu dominated. And in Ladakh, there is the Buddhist and the Muslim population, and the Muslims of Ladakh do not really align with the Kashmiris. Similarly, in Jammu, the Muslim partially sometimes align at the religious level, but on ethnic lines, they are very, very divided. So there are existing fault lines within Jammu and Kashmir, which in the past have been used by different political players, including governments sitting in New Delhi, to to weaponize Jammu against Kashmir and vice versa. But it's happening even more under the present majoritarian right-wing march in India right now. If you notice that BJP for the first time won 25 seats in Jammu, whereas its earlier record had just been about 5 to 6, 7 seats, and that's it. And so it has made the BJP and its ideology, its hate ideology has made inroads in Jammu. It has made inroads in Ladakh. In Jammu, when 2019, August 5th, 2019, when Article 370 was revoked, and there was absolute silence. Jammu's, while the entire state was militarized and, you know, a communication ban was imposed, in Jammu, it was still partial, and the restrictions were much less. And so there were people out on the roads or people on the social media who were celebrating, and who were celebrating because they felt that Kashmiris had been shown their place. So these are the kind of dynamics that the government sometimes weaponize, and some other political powers would also do it, and they do weaponize to keep communities apart rather than to bring them to a dialogue table.
Thank you. Thank you. Angana ji, do you want to add something or you're okay? Thank you.
And I wish to add some things, please.
Please go ahead.
Thank you for the question that you raised. Two things. One is psychosocial health. Before 2019, studies showed that Kashmiris lived with disproportionate psychosocial trauma. There were many that had suicidal tendencies because of the lives that they had been forced into living, the sense of hopelessness and claustrophobia. Many would describe the hundreds and hundreds of people that I have interviewed, many of them would describe Kashmir as an internment, collective internment camp. One difference from then to now is that there were possibilities for people like myself, for journalists, as Anuradha mentioned, for others to visit. The isolation was not complete. The lockdowns were not complete. And the ways in which sort of the impenetrability that has been enforced by, since 2019, by the current Hindu nationalist government has led to a collapse, sort of a mental collapse, health collapse, collapse of institutions, collapse of possibility, collapse to see what might come within. The people that I've been able to speak to and the ridiculousness that people such as myself are threatened, so we are unable to talk and do our work as scholars with people who are far more threatened than us. And the work, the little work that one is able to do, the conversations that one is able to hold, in which people reiterate repeatedly of a sense of claustrophobia, a sense of impossibility to think about what today is, what history was, what tomorrow might look like. And in that sort of living in a box without a window, day after day after day. And that seems to be the condition of a majority of the people living in Kashmir today, particularly those of Muslim descent. That's one point I wanted to make. If the NDA loses the next elections, you asked, changes. Yes, I feel we have to watch how it loses, because if it loses and its hold is less strong than before, then perhaps there is hope to reclaim some of the institutions and to push back. But to push back, there has to be sort of civil society, political, international pressure in order to push back. But if there is not, if it's sort of like it is today, then yes, there will be sweeping changes, not just constitutional or legal, but also political changes and changes on the ground. Let's not forget, if about 7 to 8 to 10% of some states, the population of some states in India are part of the Hindu right cadre, that's tens of millions of people. So changes in bolstering that as well. Let's not forget, in 2018, I believe our Hindu nationalist leader said that within 3 days, they would be able to mobilize a grassroots army should they be called upon to do so. Thank you.
You're on mute, Rafal Bhai.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to point out that the chat is disabled. If you wanted to ask a question and you don't know how to raise the digital hand, please turn on your camera and wave a physical hand, and we will allow you to ask the question. So the next person is our own Dr. Raziuddin.
Well, I'm quite curious for this one puzzle. There are a lot of Kashmiri diaspora here. Even in DC area, they are far from the Kashmir Valley. And they are in very good shape here, Boston, everywhere. Personally, I know a couple of dozens, and I have invited them to join. None of them joined. Not a single one has joined. And there are Kashmiri Pandits also, who also are bleeding. I can see a name here, which is recognizable as a Kashmiri Pandit. But why they are not forming a diaspora group to restore sanity in Kashmir, or to help out them guy, or go to embassy, or make contact, or even put the case to Capitol Hill, whatever. There is nothing really. But I know there are a very separatist group, Kashmiri group. I don't want to name it, but I know they are very active on the street here and elsewhere. But these guys, educated, well-settled guys, none of them are here. So what is going on? You both are Kashmir experts, and both are here. You must be knowing these things. So what is this?
I want to say briefly that I've spoken on numerous platforms where there have been many persons of the Kashmiri diaspora that have joined. I know a lot of people, including scholars. There's also a scholars network that I'm a part of that does regularly intervene on these issues and make statements and take action. There are groups of lawyers that are also active. There are student groups that are active. There are students whose work that I've supervised and been in contact with as well that are doing excellent work. So there are people who are speaking. There are people who are writing. There are journalists that are also active. So I do want to say that there is quite a large network across the United States. They are active. They may not have joined today for whatever the reason might be, but they are active, and I'm in touch with a number of them, and they have been doing amazing work. Also in 2019, let's not forget that it is their advocacy and push that led to the US Congress convening the first ever hearing that focused on Kashmir in October of 2019, where I was very privileged to be invited to speak. And so just that, so that it is active, and effectiveness on Kashmir is not simply cannot be measured by whether a diaspora is active or not. That we are aware of these issues have in great part to do with them, as well as to journalists that have been covering this against great odds, both in Kashmir, from India and elsewhere. But it also has to do with international political will. Just that. Thank you.
In that context, is that you must be meeting a lot of different kind of people. Is this a more popular or groups which are more as a separatist, you can say, or some who are more to go and find a solution or solvable situation, more moderate? Because I know a lot of Kashmiris who are, as you said, very actively engaged, but those groups are certainly very, what you said, more militant or more sectarian or more, it's not what a moderate, secular, all Kashmiri, where Muslim, non-Muslims like Kashmiriyat. I don't know whether that kind of group is the one that we are looking for.
I think the term separatist is maybe problematic because that's not how a lot of these groups self-identify. And I think that we should be careful in using the terms operationalized by the government of India. and at least allow for different interpretations of the same term. And I work with a lot of scholars and journalists and lawyers, and they are extremely reasoned. Some of them advocate for self-determination. Some of them understand Kashmir to be occupied, but so do most Kashmiris on the ground that I have spoken with. And for them, one thing I can say without getting into sort of all the different nuances between people in Kashmir as well as in the diaspora, but one thing seems very clear that I also am in agreement with, that for most of them, they feel that any resolution to Kashmir, any moving forward on Kashmir, must first and foremost include Kashmiris as primary stakeholders. And that hasn't happened.
Thank you.
Sorry, I also wanted to say the reason I'm asking for caution is that it's precisely terms like this that have been extended and expanded in meaning and then been repositioned as that becomes sort of, someone who identifies as, who is labeled as a separatist, then is seen as a terrorist by a certain government. So I'm just urging caution in terms of how we identify and how we should take into account how people self-identify. Thank you.
Thank you. Faisal, can you please unmute? Okay. Vivek Saab. Vivek
Yes. I just wanted to refer to visit of Prime Minister Modi to Washington. In that meeting at the end, there was no press conference. Only 2 questions were permitted, and one was on India. And that was asked by a Wall Street journalist. And everybody knows what the answer was given. In this situation, do we have any hope that US government will do something in future on this issue?
Well, the US government has just given a red carpet to Modi before he came, while Manipur was happening. I mean, forget about the history of Gujarat, of Kashmir, of the lynchings happening. I'm sure the US government knows and does not need to be told. Despite all of that, he did get, and unfortunately, I don't think that foreign relations are guided by values or a vision for a better world. They're guided by short-term concerns, by economic concerns, short-term strategic concerns. That's a real misfortune. But I think that kind of it is for maybe the diaspora communities from South Asia, or from India, from Kashmir, to push for that, and maybe at least some of us do continue to speak.
Thank you.
I wish to say that authoritarian regimes don't last. I'm sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback. Authoritarian regimes don't last. History shows us that. They usually overreach and they break. And at what point that one brick is loose in the wall that allows for that breakage, we have to wait and see. And I want to say, yes, absolutely, Washington and the red carpet was what we witnessed, but we also witnessed a lot of citizens' protests. We also witnessed the White House having to issue a statement after the journalist was targeted and trolled and received volumes of hate mail and threats because of the question that she asked, but they did have to make a statement. And then Garcetti actually asked in India if in Manipur their help would be, accepted. They are ready to help. They're in a position to offer help, which is not a lot, but it is actually something. Because as Anuradha underscored, foreign relations are defined by realpolitik. They're not defined because a government is aware or not of human rights abuses. But at some point when the two intertwine and it becomes impossible to honor foreign relations commitments because of the ways, not because they are prioritizing human rights, but because of the ways human rights infringes on the capacity to have those commitments be honored, that's when perhaps the international community begins to take action. And we have to watch and see when that moment is. It is in India, it is in Kashmir, long past that moment. But when the international community can take cognizance and what we can do here, what civil society, what diasporic individuals, immigrants, Indo-Americans can do, and starting with how to mobilize in your communities, how to talk to elected representatives, how to use the power that people have in this country, electoral and others, is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. So after Syed Amir Saab, I am gonna put few people on the spot because I am asked for that. So Professor Vinod Mabai and Professor Ravi and Tariq Farooqi Saab. So please be ready. Go ahead, Syed Amir Saab.
Thank you. Please forgive me if my question is not appropriate since I joined the forum rather late. But I admired the two ladies, journalists, very brave. My question is that you both, obviously brave journalists, and what the journalists usually are, they have to cover all these places where their own safety and well-being is at peril. Now in Kashmir, when you cover it, what kind of obstacles you have to face? And can you get inside the Kashmir? And do you have any resources which you can tap into even from outside the country? Thank you.
This is more Anuradha's question. I
Yeah.
just briefly wanted to clarify, I'm not a journalist, I'm a scholar, and I'm an academic, and I've been working in Kashmir since 2006, since 2011, January, unable to go there. I continued working with my colleagues, one of whom is now incarcerated, Khurram Pervez, others are in threat. The work is extremely precarious. I myself, and because of threats, I'm unable to go home. Colleagues on the ground are extremely both threatened and live with conditions of day-to-day precarity in Kashmir. So the work is extremely difficult, but yes, it is it is doable as much as it is possible. But in Kashmir, everything we get to know, we should understand that it is 0.1% of what is actually occurring there. Thank you.
Thank you for saying that, Angana. For me, I think it's difficult to say how difficult is the work in Kashmir, because in the last 3 decades that I've been a journalist, there have been different phases. And there was the period of the 90s, which was very difficult to operate because there was gun on both sides, not just both sides. There were different security agencies and sometimes working at cross purposes. There were different militant groups and they were working at cross purposes. And through these three decades, most of these 3 decades, I have been shuttling between Jammu and Srinagar, and I had 2 homes and 2 places of work. It has been difficult, but at least, even in the 90s, people spoke. It's after 2019 that I felt that, I didn't feel, but that's my experience, that the moment you try to meet people, they just clam up. They don't want to talk. And they don't want to talk not because they don't just trust you, but because they're living under so much fear, under so much threat. That has been a huge problem. I haven't been able to go to the valley after 2019 March. My last visit was in October 2021, because it made it extremely challenging to work from there. I could have conversations with some Kashmiris on phone or digitally, but meeting them in person, they felt more threatened. And that is one of the challenges that I'm just going to put here. But other than that, you feel you're working under so much surveillance that it's threatening for oneself as well.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add something very briefly. When I was preparing to testify to the US Congress in 2019, I received calls reminding me, apparently asking at the acting or making the call at the behest of the highest level in India, reminding me that I'm an Indian citizen, and if I choose to testify, there might be consequences. And this is here. I live here in the Bay Area. And so just imagine for someone in Kashmir seeking to take a stand, what that means. And despite that, how much we are able to still understand, even if it is 0.1%, also attest to the extraordinary courage of civil society, of lawyers, of journalists, of scholars, of students, still persisting in Kashmir. I just wanted to
Well, you are
underscore.
Indian
Yes.
citizens, both of these ladies.
Sir.
And I wonder the problems we have, what hope foreign journalists would have who are not Indian citizens, covering international news organizations, CNN or New York Times or Washington Post. They would be much worse off than you are. Is that right?
I think the
No.
worst off are the Muslim journalists.
That's right.
I mean,
And
if I went to court against internet shutdown, or I have been managing to write something, it's probably also because I'm not just an insider in Kashmir, I'm also an outsider. I'm from Jammu. I am not a Muslim.
that's right. That's right.
And that makes it a little easier for me than for the less privileged Muslim colleagues and friends.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I think Islamophobia underpins everything, every targeting that happens, as Anuradha is saying, in Kashmir. But also, let's not forget that those of us of Indian descent or continuing to have citizenship, many of us have been threatened with sedition charges, which is not something that foreign journalists experience, or foreign scholars. As I said, I'm not a journalist, I'm an academic, have experienced. They experience different threats. So there are different sort of regimes of threats on Kashmiri Muslims, on non-Kashmiri Muslims, on those of Hindu descent, on scholars, on journalists, on those who are from outside. So different regimes of threats.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move on. And Faisal, can you please allow Vinod Saab, Ravi, and Tariq Farooqi?
I made Vinod Saab and Tariq Bhai co-host, so they should be able to.
Go ahead, any one of you.
Who was the
please.
third one you said?
Ravi.
Okay,
Sinha?
I will go ahead, Rafat, if you will allow me.
Yeah, please go.
Because I just unmuted myself. Some of the questions that I would have liked to ask have already been answered. So I'll ask a different question. And that question is, how can the government, the current government in India, convince the people that 14% of the population is a threat to 80% of the population? And, you know, how can people take that seriously on one side, and on the other side talk about Akhand Bharat, so that we can have Pakistan and Bangladesh and Afghanistan as part of United India, and actually have even more Muslims in that Akhand Bharat? How can the two things be reconciled in the minds of those people who seem to believe in this?
But I don't think that the people who believe in this are looking to reconcile those things, and in Nepal as well, let's not forget. But I don't think that they are part of Akhand Bharat, I meant. But I don't think they're looking to reconcile. I think for them, it serves a purpose, this revisionist history. And revisionist history is not simply because people are invested in the actualization of Akhand Bharat. It also allows people to bracket various forms of disarray and collapse. If we just look at the condition in India in terms of internet freedom, press freedom, status of women, economic implosions, banking issues, corporatization, nationalization of people's lands, this series of issues. I'm not talking about Kashmir, I'm talking about what is in India today. Prejudicial citizenship, more than 4,600 recorded instances within a certain span of time of political violences, events of political violences that have taken place. The severity of implosion, this sort of the the currency of revisionist history and a manifest destiny, linking that to a manifest destiny, allows the government as well as leaders on the ground to bracket those issues and to say that what one is experiencing now is legitimated, because ultimately, if we push through and organize, then we will get there. More than ever before, wealth is concentrated in a fraction of Indians and most of majority descent, for example. So just that. So I don't think that these are people looking to reconcile both those issues.
Can I ask a follow-up question? You just mentioned that the wealth is concentrated among the few, and all they're from the majority community most of the time. And this government is consensus of this corporate nationalistic, kind of a government, and they appeal to those. But talking about those people who are wealthy and those people who are controlling the news and the channels, but they also had the most to gain. Some time ago, before all this happened, there was talk about open borders with Pakistan, open borders, especially between the Pakistani side of Kashmir and Indian side of Kashmir. And having a stronger economy, I would have imagined that India would have had to gain from these kind of trades and open borders. And so these people who are extremely wealthy would actually become even more wealthy. So why don't they see that as a driver rather than completely go along with the current government? Because, the channels that are owned by Ambanis and others, they basically just talk about Hindu-Muslim all the time. But I would have thought that they would have gained more this other way.
I'll just respond briefly so Anuradha can respond as well. To say that somewhere I think the logic of both making money and this disarray has been lucrative for a certain class of people, and for militarization, which itself is lucrative as well. India is now the largest importer of arms, weapons. So that form of accumulation has to also be matched by the furthering of the agenda, which is Hindu nationalism. So and you're right in saying that the conditions you name that would allow for economic, economic success, it would be economic success for larger masses of people, but that's not the intent. So one has to always sort of reconcile the political intent with the actions that are being put forward. Thank you.
Yeah, that's what exactly I was thinking. Okay, Vinod Saab or Ravi.
Okay, I'll just be very brief since we are running out of time. I just want to focus on one aspect, which is this boast of Modi regime of raising the number of tourists into Kashmir as part of their so-called economic development agenda and so on to 20 million and so forth. I just want to point out that that is probably as big a threat as anything to the continued environmental integrity of the fragile Himalayan region. We are already witnessing the effects of increase of religious tourism in Uttarakhand, where you are building new roads, building other kind of infrastructure, is having a disastrous effect on the environment. And that, I think, is likely to happen in Kashmir to a very significant extent. I spent a lot of my childhood in Kashmir because my khala and khalu, aunt and uncle, my uncle was manager of government silk factory in Rajbagh, and as a school child, we used to go there from Delhi and spend every summer. And then I visited after a long gap of almost half a century, and environmentally, it's a very, very disturbing type, not just the military, which is obscene in the extent to which it operates all over the valley, but just in the general sense of the way in which environment is being disfigured. And I think that this 20 million tourists, this Amarnath Yatra, etc., will just hasten this process a lot, which is already happening in the Himalayan region to a large extent. So I just thought I'd raise that point. It's not sustainable at all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing out that it's not sustainable ecologically, but apart from ecological disaster, I mean, an ecological disaster, not to underestimate it, it is of prime importance. But what is happening even right now, there are limited resources within Kashmir. I mean, for instance, you talk about electricity, water. Now, all this electricity and water, while it has to be diverted for the benefit of tourists, the locals are talking about massive power shutdowns and repeated power shutdowns. Other than that, and thank you also for pointing out the obscenity of the militarization. And I feel that, you mentioned it, and I've been listening to some conversations with friends back home and who've been talking about, yes, a lot of tourists are coming and they come and they see it. They see this whole military apparatus and they click selfies with the soldiers on the road, thinking that it is something really great. What that military means for the locals does not exist in the imagination of many tourists. And it is somewhere, I think, increasing that gulf and the alienation of Kashmiris from not just the Indian state, it is Indian citizens.
Thank you, Anuradha ji.
I want to
go ahead. We have only a few minutes left. Go ahead, please.
I want to underscore that how important that point is. I think that it's the relation between Kashmiris and especially Kashmiris of Muslim descent to the Indian state and the people of India. There is something that rightly broke, and to repair that would require people of Hindu descent in this moment more than ever before to speak up, to say, not in my name, this is not what I wish. And I think it's the same, an earlier point was made here, why Kashmiris are not reaching out. Why is it up to them to reach out? Should it not be up to people of Hindu descent who are looking to rethink not just nationalism, not just with respect to Kashmir as well, the relationship, but also casteism, right? You saw SB 403 in California and dissent to that. So we want caste in America. That's what's being portrayed, right, by Hindu nationalists here. And Hindu nationalists, it's very convenient for us to say it is that the lot that are organized and identify as such. But I think if we are to say that they are a fringe or they are a sizable group, but they are not us, we need to show that we are not them. We need to speak up. We need to show fundamentally with our actions, and actions that will require our losing privilege as people of Hindu descent in India. Losing privilege. Are we prepared to do that? Because if we are not, then no, it's impossible to repair the damage that has been done.
Thank you. Last comment from Professor Ravi Sanasa.
Yeah, thank you, Rafat Saab. It's difficult for me to speak about Kashmir from where I am, where I live. It's all the more difficult after such lucid presentations, but I would like to express some unease that I have about the other aspect. I live here in Delhi, and we have a very difficult political struggle at hand, and it will be perverse for me to ask people of Kashmir, people who are suffering there, to be mindful of the very difficult struggle that we have in rest of India. But maybe it is not as perverse to ask scholars and journalists, especially those who are there in US. When it is pointed out that it is only a quantitative kind of change after 2014, and that Kashmir has suffered all through in last 7 decades. And when the previous regimes are equated, the kind of situation we are facing in India, I feel uneasy about it. I mean, it goes all the way to probably Jawaharlal Nehru. Perry Anderson wrote a book a few years ago about India. I am a leftist, he is a leftist, but I didn't like him ridiculing Jawaharlal Nehru, that he will wake up from his sleep in night and shout, I want Kashmir, I want Kashmir. I mean, Jawaharlal Nehru has become the somebody to beat up with, everything is blamed on him. And if we go on to bring about that this regime is not too different or qualitatively different from previous regime, I think the realization that the kind of difficult struggle people are having in rest of India, is not realized. I mean, if there is a regime change next year, and if the people who come to power, these INDIA people, if they come to power, and if they decide that they will not reinstate 370 or will not do anything about it, what this regime has done, I will not rush to blame them, because it is more to do with Indian society, where Indian society has landed, where democracy in India has landed, how democracy has activated the fault lines of our society and our civilization, and how it is a very difficult political fight. So my unease is about, we can have a very principled stand about all the struggles, Palestine, Kashmir, Manipur, everything. But if it were only to count all those difficulties, there is some disturbance. If we were to count all that is wrong with the world, that's one thing. But if one has to find a solution, I think we are having a very difficult problem in the rest of India. We don't know how to fight it, because a lot of Indians support this regime, and even if you are critical of the previous regime, a lot of people in India supported the previous regime too. So I know the problems you are talking about. It's very true, very correct, very depressing, and you have put it very lucidly. But how the Kashmir problem will be solved is dependent on what India will become tomorrow, and what India will become tomorrow is a very difficult question that we are faced with. So that's the unease I will express, where whoever has said that INDIA people will do the same thing or similar thing, or the same thing has been going on for last 7 decades, which may be true, which is true, and yet the political struggle that we have in India, mainstream or rest of India, whichever you put it, is a very difficult struggle. That everybody should be mindful of that too. That whatever is happening in mainstream India is supported by a lot of people, whether it is Congress, that was supported earlier by a lot of people, and now today it is BJP, and it is supported by a lot of people.
I think one of the things that we're noticing is what's being implemented in India today is actually a mainstreaming of various strategies that have been tried out in Kashmir before. And I think that I don't know that either Anuradha or I suggested that what has been happening for 70 years is all the same. I think what we were putting forward rather is that the various interventions of various governments and civil society has led to what is today, right? It didn't happen by magic. It was elected twice. And that begs reflection, is what we are saying in going forward. That begs reflection and care with which we approach how to craft a future. And I think internal to India, the kinds of implosions that we are seeing is exactly what was promised. And this promissory note was actually crafted by the very people in government today in 2002, and then carefully executed in parts of Orissa, for example, carefully executed in Muzaffarnagar, some certain other places as well. So we had forewarning of what is to come, and now we are seeing in sort of the increase of it in volume and density and experimentations, where it moves from mobs to law, it moves from law to police, it moves from police to paramilitary. It's that the weaponization and militarization in society that we are witnessing is absolutely terrifying.
Thank you, everyone, for participating in the question and answer session. That concludes the session, and back to Razi Bhai, and we are already on the top of the hour.
I don't know if Anuradha had a comment. Did you have a comment?
Let's her give a chance.
Yeah, just to add to what Ravi ji's concerns and what Angana said, and from how I read, I think something that you earlier said, Angana, is that, you know, it's not only the regime change that is important for India today. And I'm not just talking about Kashmir, I'm talking of all of India. And Kashmir Kashmir's future is hinged on India's future right now. If there can be a better way forward, you need course correction in India. And so even our job doesn't stop at regime change. Regime change is not going to do anything. It is not going to take away the toxicity that this government has injected in the social, political fabric of India. We need to go back. And those parties who, if this India alliance manages to come to power, and all those parties who have been in power earlier and have made mistakes that have brought India to this point, they need reflection. They need to reflect on the policies and the actions they have taken in the past that have been flawed, and take a course correction. And that may also be the way forward for Kashmir. We cannot continue to do business as we have been continuing, because this is what it comes to.
Thank you. Thank you again for both speakers. Back to Dr. Raziuddin.
So nothing much to add, really. I will just simply say the same thing. Thank you both, and thank you all the participants. And it was really quite informative, quite revealing, and we learned a lot. But what we do beyond that, that is always a question. And in diaspora, we seem to be far more active in many issues related to India, whether in Kashmir or the rest of the India. So here, if we can do anything, that would be very good. Otherwise, it will be